Oftentimes, as a podcaster, investigator, and researcher, I'm asked if I ever really experienced anything strange, paranormal, cryptozoological. And the truth is, I have. And probably the most terrifying one was my encounter with the Hatman. Now, I need to kind of set the scene for this. So, this happened in the late 1980s. Way before I'd ever heard of the Hatman, and I think before most people had heard of the Hatman. Probably before we really ever talked about shadow people at all. I lived in a rural community on the banks of Lake Charles in Arkansas. Scattered houses, a lot of woods behind the house, and I was a teenager, probably about 16 or 17. About a mile down the road lived my girlfriend, who is now my wife. So the house that we lived in was a split level. And as I became a teenager, we finished off the basement, and that's where I lived. I had a room down in the basement, had a big living room area, and some double doors, sliding glass doors that were at the back of the house. And as most teenagers do, which they shouldn't be doing, I did sneak out of the house quite often to go down and see my girlfriend in the middle of the night. But this wasn't one of those nights originally. That wasn't my plan. I had gone to bed and went to sleep. And while asleep, I had a horrible nightmare. A nightmare of being chased through the forest and up and down roads by this horrible, gigantic shadow that I can only describe as being a giant man that was composed out of shadow, that was wearing a long trench coat, had on a wide-rimmed hat, and had glowing red eyes. And no matter where I went, no matter what I did, I could not get away from him. It was absolutely the most terrifying nightmare I'd ever had in my entire life because it was so real and I couldn't escape him. I woke up suddenly in my room, absolutely drenched in sweat and still terrified. And it's important to note that as a kid up until this point, and maybe even at this point, I was terrified of the dark. I was one of those kids who, was afraid of the monster in the closet, the monster under the bed, the thing that could be, lurking in the hallway. But nevertheless, I woke up absolutely terrified, but with one thought on my mind. I have to get to my girlfriend's house. I have to warn her. I have to tell her. I don't know why. I absolutely don't know why, and it doesn't make any sense, because you would think the thing that I would do would be to turn on the light, lock all the doors, and set up for the rest of the night. But that wasn't on my mind. I got out of bed, got dressed, very quietly snuck out the back door, as I'd done many times before and many times after this. Made my way around the house and started cutting through this field that was in front of our house and that led up to the road that went to my girlfriend's house. At some point, I realized that one of my shoes had become untied, and I stopped to tie my shoe. There was a street light out there, so I was covered in light, which wasn't very smart for a kid who was sneaking out of the house in the middle of the night. But I thought at very least, I'll be safe in the light. So I knelt down, tied my shoe, and as I'd finished up, this humongous shadow passed over me. and scared me to death. Absolutely terrified me. And I took off running faster than I've ever run in my entire life. And in school, I ran track. Once I got out of the field and I got up onto the road, and down the road a little ways, out of the light, because there were no more street lights all the way up into her house, I happened to look back because I had this feeling that something was behind me. And there in the middle of the road stood that thing. That thing that I had been terrified of. The thing that I was so afraid of, and the thing that I was so willing to risk myself in the darkness to go and warn her about. No longer was it gigantic, but every bit as tall as me, if not a little bit taller, and I'm 6'1". So it was between 6 and 7 foot tall, standing in the middle of the road, composed out of pure shadow, wearing his hat, this wide-rimmed hat, like a fedora or similar type hat. I always thought it kind of reminded me of the hat that the Quaker Oats guy wore. And then wearing this long trench coat. Upon seeing that thing, I just became so terrified because what was in my nightmare was real. And it was 200 yards behind me. But that didn't matter. I took off running. I ran as fast as I could, and it was uphill almost all the way on a gravel road. I got to her house, and I started knocking on the window, trying to be quiet, but loud enough that she could hear, and desperate for her to open the window. I was shaking, I was sweating, I was cold, I was terrified, and finally she opened the window. I climbed inside and told her the entire story. And there I stayed till almost dawn before I went back home and tried to hide the fact that the entire thing had happened. So if you ever wonder if I've ever experienced anything paranormal, anything strange, anything terrifying, I have. So for those of you out there who have experienced something strange, something terrifying, something that nobody would ever believe, chances are really good that I believe you. Because to this day, that thing that happened to me way back in 1987, 88, to this day sticks with me. And I can see that Hatman standing on the road in that streetlight just as clear as it was yesterday. So this is my encounter with the Hatman.